Hi everyone. As promised, our next lecture, which I believe is lecture 5, we're going to be talking about the ideas of Freud. Okay, we talked about the historical context of Freud in the last lecture. Now let's talk about Freud's ideas. Okay, but before we get to that, let me mention once again that the expectations of the course on terms of the discussion board are I would like you to pick two of the terms, write a paragraph each about um, each of these terms, and place kind of the term itself within the larger context of the general meaning of the this particular lecture. You should also do one additional paragraph response to something that one of your classmates has provided. Okay, so let's talk about, before we talk actually about Freud, let me give you the terms. Okay, first term is id, ego, superego. Okay, so that's one term. Id, ego, superego. And these terms will also be there in the discussion board as well, so you'll have the spelling. Second term, 5 stages of psychosexual development. Third term, theory of bisexuality. Next term, Oedipus complex, and we spell Oedipus Oedipus complex, and the next term, Electra, Electra complex. Okay, so remember we were talking the idea that Freud's a dual conflict theorist. He looks at the conflict between the conscious and the subconscious. That's one of the conflicts that he envisions in almost all of his works. And the second one is the sexual conflict between what you want to do sexually versus what you are able to do sexually or permitted to do. All right, so let's first talk about the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay, basically 3 states of consciousness. Freud says there's the id. The id is the subconscious state. The id comes out in your dreams and in your fantasies, and it's completely unrestricted and basically can do whatever it wants. So that's where you can do whatever you want without any kind of restrictions whatsoever. You can fly, for example, in your dreams, even though you can't really fly. You can sleep with a superstar who you have no chance in the world of ever getting to be with. Once again, where does this come out? In your dreams and in your fantasies. Okay, so that's the unrestricted, pleasure principle-based id state. The opposite of the id state is the idea of the superego. Okay, so the superego in this id, ego, superego term, the superego refers to the rules of society. What you're allowed to do, what's expected of you, what's moral. Because basically society's controlled, has controlled various moralities in different ways. How does it control it? It controls it by means of laws. Laws are the strongest. It also controls it by morals. Morals are strong, but not as strong as laws. You break the law, there's a penalty. You break morals, you might be censored, but you're not going to be arrested. So there's morals. There's mores. Mores are a bit lighter than morals, but still against kind of what people in your group would think. And then there's mores. Mores are just sort of conventions. So like if everybody else is putting lemon in the tea and you decide to put sugar instead. So it's not really breaking anything important, but it's still breaking what's expected in your social group. But of course, there's not going to be much or any notice or penalty for it. Okay, So society controls people by means of the societal superego. So that's the rules. So in the id state, you're completely free. In the superego balances out the id by controlling it. The ego. Okay, the ego in this term, id, ego, superego, the ego is called the mediator or the go-between because it comes between or it mediates the conflicting impulses of the completely free, pleasure-principled id and the completely controlled societal superego. So it takes elements of both. And, notice we use that term ego today. We call someone an egoist or an egotist, and what do we mean? It means someone who's all about the self, all about me. The generation which I grew up in, called the me generation, those of us who grew up in the 70s, that's all about me. How, anything mentioned, well, how does that affect me? What does this mean to me? So the ego is the me, the self, the conscious self. So it mediates between the completely free id and the completely controlled superego. So let's look at an interesting example of how we can see this. Okay, let's say, we have in the classroom, we have some students who are completely follow the rules and societal expectations. The really good students who are interested in the material, ask questions, are fascinated with it, want to know its connection to related concepts, and you really see the light in the eyes and that they really are interested in it and just want to learn it for its own sake, not just for reward. Okay, the majority of students are not going to be that way. The opposite of those students is going to be the ones who don't follow any of the rules, don't care, don't study, make it clear they're bored, or looking at their watches, or looking at pretending to hide their phones, and by the way, that you're not fooling anyone, but the ones that make it pretty clear they're not very interested in the course. Now, okay, so let's say you don't really care about a theory that's 100 years out of date, that is not directly related to your major in small animal science or large animal science or chemistry, whatever your major is. So you're like, who cares about this? So if you were in your id stage, you'd be completely free. You would have just left the room. You would not be listening to this. You'd be studying what you want to study or doing what you want. Okay, so that would be the id state. The superego would be the really good students who are taking notes and interested in things and just want to know more knowledge for the sake of, just learning. Now, most students are going to be the ego. The ego is balancing the two. So they come to class, but they're not looking particularly interested. They're taking notes, but not very many. They're snoring. They're looking bored, or that, famous, look of many people of your generation, that kind of vacant look. So now, if you were in your id state, you'd be out of here. But if you were in your superego, you'd be a really good student, but you're balancing the two. So you're here, but not really here. You're paying a little attention, but not full attention. So you're balancing the two. Isn't that a nice, good, relevant example? Okay, so anyway, that's our term id, ego, superego. Okay, our next term, let's talk about the theory of bisexuality. All right, thinking of sexuality, in the time of Freud, basically the main kind of sexuality that was even thought about at all. And remember, we talked about last time, sexuality was seen as something that you don't express and don't discuss, even with the person you're married to or sleeping with. Freud's theory of bisexuality, he says that nobody is purely gay, nobody is purely straight, everyone is somewhere on the spectrum and oscillates. So the teen years kind of known for experimentation, try a little this, try a little that, find out who you're attracted to, what you're attracted to, and kind of going, sometimes more towards your gay side, other times more towards your straight side, but then eventually ending up either closer to one or the other. There's an interesting American sexologist by the name of Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey started off actually as a zoologist and then became interested in human sexuality and did a very detailed case study of human sexuality where he interviewed hundreds of men and hundreds of women about their sex life. He wrote this interesting book called Sex in the American Male and another one called Sex in the American Female. Okay, and basically, he started what's called the Kinsey scale, which showed that the majority of people are not purely heterosexual. Some are more heterosexual than others, others are less so than others, but everyone, is not the same sexuality. Now, Freud's work is more theoretical rather than empirically proven, and Freud basically said that everyone is to some degree attracted to both sexes, but some closer to heterosexuality, desiring the opposite sex, others closer to homosexuality, desiring the opposite sex. So saying everyone's on the spectrum and people's sexuality oscillates to some extent throughout life. Okay, so theory of bisexuality. All right, remember, he's challenging and questioning a lot of things, and these are going to be upsetting to lots of people, particularly in a highly restricted, sexualized, sexually controlled culture like we saw in the time of Freud, the late Victorian age. Today it's a bit different. Like, let me ask this. Would you say the superego about sexuality is going to be stronger in Freud's time or stronger in today? And that's, once again, something you could talk about if you're analyzing this as one of your questions in your discussion. Okay, so of course it would be, in the time of Freud. Because Freud, sexuality is much more restricted. Today, most things go sexuality, at least in Western society, with the exception of a few things. All right, so let's see what else he challenges in terms of sex. Okay, so he says that no one's purely gay, no one's purely straight, everyone's a combination, so his theory of bisexuality. But then there's also the idea of what's called the 5 stages of psychosexual development. Okay, now the 5 stages of psychosexual development. Now, he's looking at the growth of sexuality, saying it's starting in infancy and continuing all the way to puberty. Now, this is, something that's seen as fairly forbidden in our society. We think of children as very innocent. What's the first word we think of with childhood? We say, an innocent child. Okay, well, Freud is going to argue that children are anything but innocents. And this concept of an adolescent, that's very much a 20th century idea. There's an interesting historian by the name of Philippe Ariès, last name spelled A-R-I-E-S. And Ariès created this book, I believe it was in the late 60s, called Centuries of Childhood. And what he shows in Centuries of Childhood is the idea that the concept of adolescence, this go-between between adulthood and childhood, was actually a social construct of the early 20th century. So it didn't always exist. Children were traditionally seen as little children. Children were seen as little adults. So people felt that it was fine for children to work because if adults could work, why couldn't children? And they also felt that children were sexual beings, just immature or smaller versions of the same sexual beings that adults were. So Freud is saying that children are very sexual. So he basically says childhood sexuality goes through 5 steps called the 5 stages of psychosexual development. Okay, now he's going to agree that people are going to go through these stages and stay in various stages at different ages. So the ages he gives is going to, vary to some extent with the individual, and Freud was willing to accept that. But he believes that the stages always follow the same order. So the 5 stages he gives are going to be called, the first stage would be the oral stage, the second stage, the anal stage, the third stage, the phallic stage, the fourth stage, the latency period, and the fifth stage, the genital stage. So let's look at each of these 5 stages. Okay, so he says children start off in their oral stage, so that's going to be from infancy to about age 2.5 to 3. And in the oral stage, the child explores the world by sucking on things, licking in things, and sucking and licking on things gives them comfort, happiness, relaxation, and stimulates what he calls the libido, Libido. Libido means basically the sex drive. So these things the child would find, at least some of it, as a sexual experience. So the oral stage. Okay, the second stage is going to be the anal stage. The anal stage is going to be somewhere around age 2.5 to 3, and it lasts till about age 5. During the anal stage, that's often connected to toilet training, the child becomes very obsessive with the holding in and releasing of bowel movements. So he becomes aware of the anus as a sexual center and finds pooping to be an erotic sensation. And, we use that term today. We call someone anal. What do we mean? When we call someone anal, they're uptight and rigid and controlling and so Freud's going to say that's related to bowel movement training, and the ones who become anal are usually the ones that hold the bowel movement in. They don't want to be messy and dirty and sloppy and let things slop all over the place. Okay, the third stage is going to come in around the age of 5, and it lasts till around age 7. That's when the child becomes very aware of their genitalia and they start touching themselves. Okay, so the child starts openly masturbating, realizing it brings them comfort, happiness, and excitement. So they become aware of their genitalia as a means of sexual excitement and connect the two. And parents have kind of responded to that in different ways. Some people kind of just pretend it's not happening and ignore it. Others are making a big deal about it and saying it's shameful and sinful, and if you keep doing that, it's going to fall off or decay. Then there's kind of the more balanced approach where you say this is something everyone enjoys, but certain things are accepted in public, others in private. This is definitely something that should be done in private according to the expectations and rules of our society. But anyway, that's the phallic stage. Okay, the fourth stage is going to be the latency period. Latency period lasts from about 7 till roughly 11 to 12. And the latency period is where the child becomes less concerned with his sexuality. Sexuality kind of goes underground. The child doesn't act on it. It doesn't acknowledge it. And it's often seen as kind of the cootie stage, where boys and girls tease each other. Boys pretend not to like girls and how much they hate girls, and vice versa with the girls towards the boys. In years past, it's where the boys would take the girls' hair and take long hair and dip it into the ink wells and look like they hate them, but in reality really like them, but no, they don't have the wherewithal or the comfort level yet to associate purely with girls, so spend all their time with boys talking about girls and how much they hate them. Then the child at puberty, so coming in around 11 and a half, a little later sometimes, is when the child enters the genital stage. And in the genital stage, the child becomes a full-fledged sexual being. And there, as a full-fledged sexual being, sometimes the genital stage is seen as a social aspect of the phallic stage. So all the same sensations and pleasures that the child brought to himself in his phallic stage, he now realizes even better in having sexual relations with others. So he becomes a full-fledged sexual being, and this lasts throughout his whole life. Okay, our next term is going to be the Oedipus complex. Okay, so next term is Oedipus complex, spelled Oedipus complex. Okay, the Oedipus complex is dealing with a theme in Greek mythology. Now, people at the time of Freud, any educated person, they would have been trained very well in the classics. So they would know the Greek and Roman myths inside out and backwards. And one of the myths is dealing with King Oedipus. Now, there's a famous trilogy by the tragic playwright Sophocles, Sophocles. So Sophocles, who was a tragic playwright, please do not confuse him with Socrates. Socrates is a philosopher. Sophocles is a playwright. Okay, so Sophocles writes this trilogy dealing with King Oedipus of Thebes. King Oedipus of Thebes, in the 3 books, eventually is going to end up getting with a fight with his father without knowing that it's his father. He ends up killing his father, and then he marries his mother and has 4 children with her. Well, that's definitely going to be one of those oops moments when he finds out the truth. Okay, perhaps we're definitely a whole lot more than an oops moment. So this famous myth becomes the background for Freud's theory of sexuality, where he says all boys on the way to full-fledged adult manhood goes through a stage where he falls in love with his mother and resents his father because his father has what the boy really wants, which is his mother's love, affection, and sexuality. So that deep down the boy wants to sleep with his mother, possess the mother, have the mother for himself, and he resents his father because they're both after the same woman. So he wants to destroy his father and then have the mother for himself. Now that may sound pretty far-fetched to most people, but at the same time, you ask a little boy, who do you want, like a 4-year-old, who do you want to marry when you grow up? And who's the boy likely to say? Mommy. And we go, ha 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 ha, isn't that cute? Okay, why do we find that cute? But then let's say we ask a boy at 13 or 14 the same question, and he gives the same answer. Now, is that still cute, or is it gross and disgusting and disturbing? Well, why? Okay, what has changed? Well, the boy at 4 is innocent. He doesn't realize it's socially unacceptable to desire your mother in that way and to want her as your mate. And he also doesn't understand that marital relations include sex. The boy at 13 or 14, of course, does. So in doing that, he is breaking a lot of taboos. Okay. So what's the boy to do? He has this conflict where he wants his mother, but society says he can't have her. Well, he looks for, in a spouse, someone who has the characteristics of his mother. So that's the way that he fulfills his Oedipus complex. Okay, the feminine version, also coming from a Greek myth, dealing with Electra. Electra. So our next term is going to be called the Electra complex. In the Electra complex is basically the feminine version of the Oedipus complex. And in the Electra complex, a girl on the way to full-fledged adult womanhood falls in love with her father. So she basically despises her mother, resents her mother, and gets in battles with her mother because she really wants daddy for herself. She wants to be daddy's little girl forever. She loves her daddy and she wants to be with him and she wants to sleep with him. But at a certain point, she realizes this is socially unacceptable. So what does she do? She looks for, in a husband or a boyfriend, characteristics of her father, and that becomes a way of making it socially acceptable to our society.